Welcome to the Sunday message from Hollyview Church in Boring, Oregon. We gather every Sunday morning as a worshiping community of Jesus followers on mission to see God glorified in our lives, our cities, and around the world. At Hollyview, the Bible serves as our foundation and guide for both life and ministry. It tells the story of God and the story of us. We believe the better we know the themes and flow of the biblical story, the better we will be able to find our little place in God's grand storyline. Thank you for joining us. And now here's this week's message from Hollyview Church.
So we've been working our way through the Gospel of Mark. And if you didn't notice this morning, as we got into chapter 11, we're moving into the Passion Week. And, just reflecting on what that means a little bit, because most people, when you say Passion Week, they go, what do you mean, Passion? It's Jesus coming to that focal point of why he was there, why he came. He came to give himself as the substitutionary atonement for our sins. And this is the week. And so we call it the Passion Week. Oh, and by the way, Megan, I'm going to take us through the whole week here in 3 minutes or less. Well, I don't know if I can do anything in 3 minutes or less, but we'll try. So day one of the Passion Week, you just saw as that triumphant entry into Jerusalem. And it's really kind of interesting as you start thinking your way through this, because when Jesus says, go and get the colt and bring it, that's actually fulfilling prophecy. Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9 talks about an unridden colt will be used for the Messiah to come in. I think it's also interesting when the people, not being led by the disciples or by Jesus, but remembering Psalm 118, which was used twice in the year by all of Jerusalem, all the Jews as they were coming into Jerusalem. It was used as part of the liturgy for the Feast of Tabernacles and for Passover. And so what was it they were saying? Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's Psalm 118, which, by the way, is also one which deals with God's supply and with the coming of the Messiah. So that's day one. The week ends with Jesus being crucified and buried in the tomb. And if you remember, Isaiah 53 verse 9 talks about the tomb that he would be in. He would be with the rich. And it was a borrowed tomb from a wealthy man. Now, some of you are saying, wait a minute, JR, finish this. What about the resurrection? Well, the resurrection doesn't happen during the Passion Week. Why? When was the resurrection? First day of the next week of what we now call Resurrection Week. So this is that Passion Week, and what I want to do is I want to just quickly walk us through the whole Passion Week as you see it in the book of Mark. So here's where we're going to race through. So Mark chapter 11 actually covers 3 days. So we see Jesus entering the city, and he's coming in from Bethany, and he goes back out each night, goes back out. I'm going to speculate here, and I think I got a pretty good shot on this, that he was probably staying the night with Lazarus. Because, interestingly enough, when you go look in John chapter 12, Jesus came to Bethany 6 days before Passover, and Lazarus had him for dinner. Didn't have him for dinner, had him as a guest for dinner. Let me fix that. Verses 12 through 19 become day 2. And Jesus goes into town, and in the evening, back to Bethany. This is where we run into the curse of the fig tree. Now, I had to do some research. I don't know how many of you have wrestled with this and said, what was Jesus talking about? Why was he mad at the fig tree? It's just a fig tree. It's an interesting thing. The blossoms of the fig tree are actually edible. And it's from that blossom that the fig actually grows. I didn't know that. But what's really interesting is when the leaves are on, the blossoms should have been there. This was literally an unfruitful tree. Oh, it starts making sense now. And I have to wonder if Jesus isn't, even as he's speaking to the tree, and you're saying, JR, he's speaking to the tree, it's just a tree. I got to wonder if it's not also a picture of Israel. Israel looked good from a distance religiously. But what were they like at their core? When you get up close and you start to inspect and look for fruit, they were a much more fruitless people. I just find that kind of interesting. So that's day 2. That's Monday. That brings us then to verses 20 through 33, day 3, Tuesday. Jesus and the disciples pass by the fig tree, and they get to see it withered. And how does it describe it? To the roots. There was no coming back for that tree. It was dead. And I have to wonder at what Jesus was getting at and his interchange between himself and Peter and talking about what God wants to do if we're willing, if we're in submission to him, if we're willing to be obedient. And I gotta kind of think here that he's got a real statement for where Israel was. That's chapter 11. Chapters 12 and 13 cover the majority of Tuesday. So that's like you got the introduction to Tuesday. 12 and 13 cover the rest of Tuesday. Chapter 14, verses 1 through 11, takes us through Wednesday. And now I want to just tell you, some of you, you've got your study Bibles and you may be looking at notes right now saying, is he right about this or not? Well, guess what? There's a little in-house debate here. So, you please don't call me a heretic. If you don't agree with me on this, that's fine. It's just, there's a little debate as to how all this quite fits together for each of the days. And it's Tuesday and Wednesday that we have the biggest question mark. So I'm going to tell you, this is what I found. This is where I'm at. This seems to be Wednesday, which then takes us to chapter 14, verses 12 through 72, which covers Thursday and into Friday. Because now remember, when did a new day begin in Jewish tradition? Sunset, right? So they had the Last Supper together, and we know it was nighttime, so it was probably after sunset. So we're into Friday when they went out to the Garden of Gethsemane, right? So that's where we get that connection and that timeline. That takes us to Friday. Then chapter 15 begins with Jesus before the Jewish council and concludes with him having been crucified and buried by Joseph of Arimathea. That's a quick overview of the Passion Week. So file all that in the back of your head, and I want to take us back to the end of chapter 11. And please keep in mind what we saw on Monday and early Tuesday with the fig tree. And again, like I said, it looked good from the distance, but in reality, there was just no fruit there. And I really do have to wonder about this being a picture of Israel. And where it becomes more apparent is as we continue in, because what happens next? We see Jesus go in, and I just find this real interesting, the interchange that he is about to have. This dialogue between himself and the leaders, the religious leaders of Israel. So grab your Bibles. I want to focus in starting at verse 27. And I think it's good if you can really be looking at it with me here. So let me begin at verse 27. It says, "And they came again to Jerusalem, and as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him. And they said to him, 'By what authority are you doing these things? Or who gave you this authority to do them?' Jesus said to them, 'I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? Answer me.' And they discussed it with one another, saying, 'If we say from heaven, he will say, why didn't you believe him? But if we say from man, they will be afraid, the people, for they all held that John really was a prophet.' So they answered Jesus, 'We do not know.' And Jesus said, 'Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things.'" You know, Father, as we really dig into this passage here, will you take charge and make sure that what is spoken today is in obedience to you, that we would really be willing to look at ourselves and look at what you want to do in each of our lives, Jesus. Pray in your name. So, why were the teachers even coming to Jesus to begin with? Go back to Monday. What did he do on Monday? Help me. What did he do on Monday? Yeah, he went and cleaned out the temple, right? If you look back to verse 15, it says that they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. See, what was going on there was you had a bunch of merchants in there, you had a bunch of bankers in there, and you had people that were literally using the temple as a shortcut to carry stuff between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives. So it was like they were making it on a highway. What did Jesus say that place was supposed to be? Place of prayer for who? For all the nations. Which kind of indicates where he's talking about. They're not inside the building, they're outside, right? And they're out in that area for the Gentiles. And Jesus is saying this whole place has been set apart for this, and you're messing it up. And this is where it gets really interesting, and I want you to kind of examine this with me just a little bit. I didn't read verse 17. It says here that while he was teaching them and saying to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." What was going on here was you had a combination of farmer's market and a currency exchange. That's what's going on here. Travelers, when they came into Jerusalem to offer sacrifices, well, they could bring their sacrifices, But guess what? Oftentimes, those that were brought from outside were rejected because they weren't perfect. But if you just came with money and you bought one of the animals that was there at the temple that had already been inspected by the priests, then you were guaranteed it would be okay. Oh, and by the way, evidently there was a little kickback that came to the priests for their inspection. You cover the cost, right? So you had that going on. But now, okay, that explains the merchants, but what about the money changers? Why did they need that? Roman coinage was not acceptable in the temple. What was the money they used everywhere? Roman coinage, right? So when you come in to the temple, you got to exchange it for the closest thing they had to Jewish coinage with a small fee. And that small fee, a portion of that would get kicked back to the priests. Anybody sensing a pattern here, a little theme? This wasn't just about worshiping God. This was about a little bit of creative entrepreneurship. So we've left out one group, right? That was the travelers. The ones that were just trying to get their stuff between Mount of Olives and Jerusalem. What was it that was going on with that? Well, it was just basic disrespect, wasn't it? They didn't care what was going on. They had to get from point A to point B. They wanted the shortest route. They're lazy like me. I have a tendency to want to make it as simple as possible. I get where they're coming from. Did it make it right? No. Because what was being lost in the midst of all this? Guys, help me out, because we've already talked about it a little bit. What got lost in all this? Huh? Yeah, the focus. What's the temple supposed to be about? Well, worshiping God. All that goes on in that interaction where we have a relationship. But what happens if all that relationship really becomes this transactional? Are we left with a relationship? Or are we just left with a business deal? See what's going on, you guys? Does that make sense? I'm looking out, and the lights are on, but I'm not sure. Is anybody home? You guys get where I'm coming from this? And going back to the fig tree, had leaves from a distance that looked good, but when you got to it, there wasn't anything there. What was happening at the temple? Looked good, a lot of activity, but did it really focus in on worship, on meeting with God? And that was a question. That's where Jesus said, nah, my house be a house of prayer for the nations. Oh, man. So who ruined it? Who messed this up? Help me out. Come on. Interact with me for a second. Remember, I like dialogue. Who messed this up? What people? They're all people. Which ones? The what? Yeah. They glommed onto an opportunity. How about the travelers? They wanted convenience. Sounds strangely like today, doesn't it? Just saying. I want you to really think this through. Because, this brings us back to when the priests and the scribes and the elders come up to Jesus and say to him, by what authority are you doing these things? You're screwing up our deal here. Who gave you the authority to do this? And that's when Jesus asks them that question. And guys, I want you to look at this carefully, because maybe this is just me and not you. Maybe you have a much better picture of this. When I look at this, I want to be just really critical. And yet, when I look in the mirror, I see that I can have the same tendencies. So what sets me apart from them? Jesus asked this question. And the answer that they gave back was what really demonstrated the issue. Because they gave a political answer to a hard issue. Kind of like what we do sometimes when we show up at church on Sunday mornings. And, we had one of those mornings where, somebody spilled stuff on their clothes just before you were ready to leave. So then you have to go back and change and get everybody in the car. And then you start arguing in the car on the way here. And then you get into the parking lot and you put on your happy face and come in. And when people ask, how you doing? You say, fine, right? Doing fine. Are you? See, these guys gave a political answer. They knew if they said that John was from heaven, he was given to them as a prophet, as that picture, then Jesus would have asked, why'd you reject him? They didn't want to have to answer that question. So the other option was to say no, but if they said no to him, and everybody's listening in on this, because that area is not a quiet place, then what are the people going to say? They're going to be ticked, because they really did believe that John was a prophet. So they give the political answer. Fine. We don't know. We don't know. Was Jesus angry with them? Look at the text for a minute, because I had to kind of chew on this a little bit. Was Jesus angry at them? What's the text indicate? It doesn't say, does it? But I have to wonder, it was probably less anger, and it was probably more frustration and pity. Here are the leaders of Israel. Here are the religious leaders that are supposed to be helping the people worship God, meet with God, have a relationship with God. And what are they doing? Everything but that. And they can't even give an honest answer. And I think Jesus looked at him and said, here we are, we just installed new elders. He looks at them and says, there ain't one of you that's qualified to be doing what you're doing. And I don't think he was angry. I think he was sad. That he had to reject them. And these guys, the heart of these men was all wrapped up in greed and power and control. You go back to 1 John chapter 2, remember how it talks about the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, the boasting and pride of life? That was these guys. They'd gotten their focus off of what they had been called to do And all it was a job. Instead of really leading God's people. And I find it really interesting because if you stop and think about it, when he asked that question, he gave these guys a chance to do it right, didn't he? He gave them the opportunity to be able to say, you know what? We said that John was not of heaven, but, you know, God used him. They could have said that. And if they had said that, do you think Jesus would have chastised them for it? I don't think so. I think he would have used that as a teachable moment to build them up. But sadly, unfortunately, he had no opportunity to do that. Instead, all they could do is demonstrate their blindness, their pride, and their desire for power. That was what was more important to them. You know, guys, what this really brought me to, this whole interaction just screams to me. And I hope it grabs you to stop and remember again. Here we are in the Passion Week. Jesus is there. Why? Out of the depth of his love for us. And he wants these guys to be in right relationship with God. He came out of his love for us. He died on the cross out of love and out of a commitment to redeem us. His resurrection is proof of that claim. And he offers this incredible relationship for eternity if we're just willing to submit ourselves. And yet, here were these guys that knew all the rules, that were supposed to know what the relationship with God looked like, but were absolutely blind to it. And what I want you to see today is that doesn't have to be us. Those guys had their opportunity. They messed up. That's between them and God. We have opportunity. And I really think that this, as I look at the picture of Passion Week, here is Jesus absolutely pouring himself out to anybody who wants to be in relationship. And so when you come here as a body and are in relationship with each other, this is that opportunity you can have to really, truly encourage and invest in each other. Jesus tried to invest in them, but they rejected it. There were people around that circle, though. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that this interaction was not done in a vacuum. It was not done off in a corner. And there were lots of other people listening. And as they were listening, they were going, wait a minute. This is more than about ritual and rules. This is about relationship. And that's what Jesus wants to constantly be building in his church, is relationship. Relationship between God and man, and relationship between God's people. Don't miss that. It's easy sometimes when we get looking at passages like this to just look at it and to criticize those who blew it and to say, yeah, Jesus is okay. But I hope you go past that and really start thinking about what his heart was, even in this week as he is preparing to die. Because it goes from everything's cool on Sunday, glad to have you, to how quick can we bury you? And he did it all for us. Father, help us to just continue to be open to your word and let your word be constantly at work conforming us to you. We want to be in relationship with you, in obedience to you. Do what you have to do. Confront us where we need to be confronted. Encourage us where we need to be encouraged. And use the body to be constantly encouraging each other as we continue to grow in our walk with you, Jesus. I pray this in your name.